Okay, so we are going to go ahead and pick up where we left off in the from the last lecture. And so we're going to talk about the last two Freud's psychosexual stages. Just to kind of reiterate, something that we went over last class was this idea of the Oedipus complex. And so essentially what this is when a boy, for example, desires his mother, and when a girl desires her father. And so we talked about this idea that when this is occurring during the phallic stages, about 3 to 6 years old, Freud was, very outspoken about his stages. And basically, if you were in a particular stage, you had to resolve some conflict in order to go to the next stage. And if you became sort of fixated in a particular stage and could not resolve the conflict, then in essence, what happens is that you develop, not a healthy personality, or that you may have issues as an adult that are, exaggerated issues. And so, of course, because we see this particular phallic stage in children, a proper resolving of this conflict is, of course, for boys to recognize that they cannot have their mothers. And so then they start identifying with their fathers and imitating their fathers. And then that essentially moves them to the next stage, which is the latency stage, which is about ages 7 to 11. And of course, girls in the phallic stage desire their fathers, realize that they aren't able to get their fathers, and then they end up identifying with imitating their mother, and again, move to the latency stage. And so essentially what ends up happening is when a child is able to properly identify with the same-sex parent, they're able to repress those sexual impulses. And so during this particular stage, those sexual urges become repressed. And so because they are repressed and dormant, the child can now develop same-sex friendships. So girls can be friends with other little girls, boys can be friends with other little boys, and focus on important things in their life, for example, school and sports and other extracurricular activities. And so they can, redirect that focus into what's important for them to mature as children. And then once they are in this particular latency stage, what really kickstart this, of course, is adolescence. This next stage is adolescence, and the physical maturation that comes with adolescence. And this would be Freud's genital stage. And of course, this ends, his psychosexual stages really end in adolescence. And so the final resolution of the Oedipus complex occurs in the genital stage. So this is, where puberty's hit. And so essentially what ends up happening is these incestuous urges start to resurface. Boys start desiring their mothers, girls start desiring their fathers again during adolescence. But one thing is different here that's different from the phallic stage. Their superego is much more mature, much more developed. Now remember, the superego's job is to essentially act as the conscience, the conscience, the sense of right and wrong. And so because the child now has a much better developed superego and understands society and societal restrictions, what we see is that the person will start to direct those sexual urges towards socially acceptable substitutes, which would be, of course, their peers. So they would start seeking out relationships with people who are about the same age and maturity level. And so, of course, we see the genitals becoming a sense of pleasurable sensation. And so an individual will then seek out a heterosexual relationship, which, an actual final resolution of the Oedipus complex may be that a person might actually seek out an opposite sex partner, right, who actually resembles their parents. And so we can see this sort of developing in some individuals. So that's pretty much Freud's stages. When we look at the Neo-Freudians, which are essentially those who have either studied directly under Freud or came about in terms of their theories on personality from Freud's basis. We see individuals like Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung was, of course, he was a student of Freud, and Freud really wanted Carl Jung to be his prodigy. He wanted Freud wanted Jung to carry on his legacy. And so it ended up happening that Carl Jung and him started to separate because Jung was creating his own theories and separating from Freud's ideas. Freud didn't really like that. And by the time that they were adult, Jung was prominent in his field, closer to Freud's death. They actually had a pretty bad falling out and were no longer on speaking terms. But Carl Jung, gave quite a bit of influential ideas to psychology. And one of those was the collective unconscious, which we'll talk about in a minute. Carol Horney was also a Neo-Freudian that had a lot of disagreement with Freud on many of his views on women. She focused on security, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of her alternative ideas. And then finally, Alfred Adler gave us individual psychology and some important terms that you might actually be familiar with. So the key part about all these Neo-Freudians, not just Jung, Horney, and Adler, but many of the Neo-Freudians agreed with Freud in certain major points. First of all, they did agree with this idea that the unconscious was important. That was really a driving factor of the psychoanalytic approach. Another thing was that early childhood experiences were very important. And this is important to note because not all the personality theories talk about the unconscious in early childhood experiences. However, all the Neo-Freudians, of course, developed their own unique theories on personality and have differed with Freud in a few important, pertinent ways. And these are important to know. First of all, the Neo-Freudians disagreed with Freud on these three basic points. Number one is that Freud believed that behavior was primarily motivated by sexual urges. Now, the Neo-Freudians all acknowledged that sexual urges had something to do with it. They have something to do with this maturing of personality and all that, but it is not the driving motivation that Freud claimed it was. The second thing is that Freud believed that personality was fundamentally determined by early childhood experiences, that this formulated your personality, and that you were a direct result of those early childhood experiences. Now, Neo-Freudians said, yes, childhood experiences are very important. Early childhood experience, very, very important in personality, but personality is not fundamentally determined by, you're not, limited to only what you experience in early childhood. That it's important, but it's not the driving factor. And then finally, Freud was extremely pessimistic of human nature and society. He is very well known for saying man is wolf to man. He was, writing a lot of his theories and talking about a lot of his ideas during World War II. Freud was Jewish. He was in a Nazi-occupied area. He actually had to escape his home country for fear of persecution of the Nazis. We're talking about a person who understood that people can do really terrible things, and that shaped the way that he thought about people. And so the other Neo-Freudians really did not have as much of a pessimistic view on men, on man, on society, on human nature as Freud did. So that's an important thing to note, is he was probably the most pessimistic. Now, let's talk about Carl Jung for a second. So Carl Jung, if you've watched the movie Assassin's Creed or read a few dream interpretation books, you might have actually seen a lot of Carl Jung's work on the unconscious, the collective unconscious. Essentially, that we all share an unconscious mind. We are all connected to one another, all humans. And he believed that we were all motivated by this sort of general psychic energy. And so he believed essentially that there was this thing called archetypal images. And so these are found in popular myth and novels and films. He believed that essentially in every aspect of human culture, regardless of the culture, every culture had these archetypal themes that were expressed in story, in movies for the more advanced cultures, or not necessarily advanced, but the more media driven cultures. And these stories have the same themes, the hero, the powerful father, the nurturing mother, the witch, the wise old man, the innocent child, death, rebirth. If you look at Wizard of Oz, for example, it has pretty much all of those things. He also believed that the two major archetypes is the anima and the animus. And the anima is the feminine, the animus is the masculine. And so he believed that these were, throughout all of human culture. He also believed, of course, that since we were all driven by a psychic energy, depending on how we projected that energy would mean if we're an introvert or extrovert. And so he was the first person to really coin those terms. And so an introvert essentially is a person who directs their energy inward, who is more isolated and ponders upon themselves. An extrovert is somebody who's going to direct that energy outward, and be perhaps more outgoing and less isolated. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and I'm going to on Jung, and I'm going to move on to Karen Horney in the next one, just to kind of break these videos up just a bit.